Demonstrations against the South African government's strict apartheid policies flare into shocking violence. At Sharpsville, an industrial township, thousands gather outside a police station in protest against new laws requiring every African to carry a pass at all times.
In 1960, over 5,000 black South Africans protesting racial inequality were shot by the police. The Pan-African Congress and the African National Congress, two groups fueling opposition to apartheid, were banned and forced underground. This violence was prompted by earlier legal reform heavily restricting the rights of the native peoples. Since the creation of the Union of South Africa, blacks had been systematically disenfranchised, leaving them confined to black-only ghettos, with lower-paying jobs, extreme widespread poverty, and restriction on travel to certain places within the country. How did this divisive system of racial oppression come about? The answer stems from an even earlier conflict, beginning with 17th century Dutch exploration. The Dutch East India Company settled in Cape Town in the 1600s, forcing the indigenous blacks to provide labor and resources for Dutch economic gain. Conflict began when control of Cape Colony was passed to the British in the late 1700s, creating a situation where a British government ruled over a population of Dutch farmers, British settlers, and blacks. British control of South Africa brought intense animosity, social separation, and heavy loss of life, as the Dutch farmers resisted British rule. This struggle for power culminated in the two Boer Wars, after which South Africa was eventually granted independence from Great Britain. The compromise between the two groups was the British government pulling out of South Africa, leaving behind a white-dominated society determined to secure superiority over the indigenous people of South Africa. The Dutch East India Company arose from the demand for a new route to reach India and the lucrative Spice Islands, while avoiding the Venetian monopoly of the Mediterranean Sea. While trying to find such a route, shipwrecked Dutch sailors were forced to await rescue at the Cape of Good Hope for nearly a year. By 1652, they ultimately decided to settle in the area due to the abundance of natural resources and material. Thus, Cape Colony was founded with an economic hub located in Cape Town. The Dutch East India Company mainly sought profit rather than colonization. They saw the natives and the environment as resources and exploited them. As a result, the Dutch enslaved most of the natives and the South African economy thrived with the discovery of diamonds and precious metals. As Cape Colony became more and more lucrative, some Dutch people settled permanently and began a life of farming. They became known as the Boers, the Dutch word for farmer. However, the Boers were not the only settlers in South Africa. British settlers joined them nearly 200 years later. Britain gained control of the Dutch colony from the Congress of Vienna in 1814 and proceeded to settle in the area in 1820, seeking the benefits of favorable trade and abundant resources. Upon arrival, the British looked to assert their dominance over the Boer settlers, immediately establishing rule over much of the Boer population. Many Boers felt displaced by laws declaring only English as the official language of Cape Colony. At the same time, slavery was outlawed throughout the British Empire in the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, forcing many Boers to free their slaves with little compensation and conflicting with their lifestyle by limiting their ability to farm. The introduction of new British settlers and a British government threatened the autonomy of the Boer farmers. As a result, they began to migrate further and further inland, away from the British in a mass migration known as the Great Trek. The Boers proceeded to settle inland by forming the Transvaal State and the Orange Free State. Despite this, both the Boers and the British remained at an uneasy peace with each other for 60 years. However, this unstable peace was broken in the First Boer War, resulting from growing tensions between the newly independent Boer states and the British government. The British sought to control the Boers who had migrated away and the abundance of precious metals in those areas. However, when the British tried to annex Boer territory in 1880, war broke out. The Boers, with their expert marksmanship and geographical knowledge, ultimately defeated the British forces, signing a deal favoring themselves with the Pretoria Convention in 1881. The Transvaal and Orange Free State would legally be mostly independent, with British control of their foreign affairs, a process called suzerainty. More power was granted to the Transvaal State in the London Convention of 1884, offering full internal independence. However, these resolutions did not resolve the animosity and conflict between the British and Boers, and tensions boiled over into a much more bloody and brutal war, the Second Boer War. The British feared the Transvaal State and the Orange Free State were allying against them, and responded by lining up troops on the border of the territories. The Boer states responded with an ultimatum requiring Britain to withdraw. Britain refused, and war broke out. Despite initial Boer success, the well-trained and equipped British forces dominated. By June of 1900, the British had captured the Transvaal capital, Pretoria, and were on the verge of winning the war. The Boers shifted to guerrilla warfare tactics, and, in response, the British employed a scorched earth policy, destroying Boer farms, villages, and supply networks.
They inter Afrikaner women, children. It's a violent war. A scorched earth tactic on both sides.
It was this extreme violence on the British side that pushed the Boers to eventually give in to their oppressors. The Second Boer War officially ended in May of 1902 with the signing of the Treaty of Vereeniging. It required all Boers from both states to give themselves up, swear allegiance to the British Crown, and disarm themselves. In return, the British avoided the death penalty for war crimes, gave general amnesty to the Boers, allowed the usage of Dutch in schools and courts, and provided over £3 million for reconstruction of houses and farmland. Additionally, the Republic of Transvaal and the Orange Free State were immediately made colonies of the British Empire, but they were put on a path of eventual self-governance. But the more historically significant compromise took place during the creation of the South African Union. For the first time, the Transvaal Republic, the Orange Free State, and the previously British Cape Colony and Natal Colony were all under British rule. However, there was one last obstacle in the path for a united South Africa. The Boers were resentful toward the British, preferring their own autonomy over British rule. The administrators knew that in order for the South African Union to be successful, the Boers had to support the new government. Another reason for the seemingly favorable deal for the Boers was the British media's coverage of the war. Activists like Emily Hobhouse exposed the harsh treatment of Boers by the British during the Second Boer War, showing to the people of mainland Britain the atrocities that their empire was committing against innocent Boers in Cape Colony.
There's also a name I'm sure you've come across, Emily Hobhouse, and she is one of the chief critics of the British war machinery. So the greatest threat to British imperialism comes not from the Afrikaners, but from the British treatment of the Afrikaners.
From their first settlements, Boers strongly believed their race was superior to the natives. The British used this idea as a bargaining chip, giving the Boer the majority of control in the newly formed legislature, in exchange for their support. This was minority rule over the majority, as Boers were vastly outnumbered by the blacks. Eventually, the British and the Boers reached a compromise. The British were able to maintain some economic benefit from South Africa as they kept control of mining resources, thus retaining some access to precious metals. Thus, through this compromise, the Union of South Africa was formed. This racially biased legislature passed several unjust laws, beginning with the Land Act in 1913, which prevented blacks from owning land within certain parts of Cape Town. The 1918 Natives and Urban Areas Act forced blacks into Bantustans, black ghettos that were economically disenfranchised and located far away from large cities like Cape Town and Pretoria. Laws such as the 1923 Urban Areas Act and the 1926 Colour Bar Act prevented blacks from obtaining certain high-paying skilled labor jobs. Once South Africa was given total constitutional independence from Britain in 1933, the government passed even more laws disenfranchising blacks, such as the Native Representation Act in 1936, forcing blacks to vote for only white representatives. From the first entrance of British settlers into previously Boer-controlled South Africa in 1820, conflict between the two groups was inevitable. The British imperialist goals and culture did not mix with the agrarian, slave-owning Boer lifestyle, and with both coexisting in close proximity, tensions escalated quickly. These tensions culminated into the bloody Boer Wars, after which the British and Boers both agreed to new terms under the Treaty of Vereeniging and other negotiations. While the Boers politically benefited from the new agreement, the British were able to gradually transfer power to the South African government, appeasing internal British pressure while also maintaining economic relations within the region. The result was a South African government led by the Boers, favoring white supremacy over other races, especially the native blacks. This new government provided a compromise between the Boers and the British, but it also set up a new, equally devastating conflict to come between whites and blacks in South Africa, the infamous apartheid.